So the theme of this talk is building companies in a connected world. I think the conference organizers meant connected in a technological way.
Yeah.
But given that we're in London now, with the UK possibly a week away from disconnecting politically with the rest of Europe, I want to ask you, as a tech investor, what do you make about the upcoming EU referendum?
Yeah, well, I kind of certainly believe in a connected world. So if we disconnect, it's going to be a disaster. You know, I came to London in 2002. You know, one-way ticket, Ryanair flight, me and my wife, 3 bags. We went to London because we thought this is a perfect city to build a global business from. And since then, you know, I think it's been a great place to build a global business. And you know, if I would be a younger version of myself, would probably not go to, you know, if there's a Brexit, I probably would not go to London. I probably would go to Berlin. And I think that would be not because, you know, I think growth is coming from entrepreneurs, from tech companies, and London has really, really become a magnet for entrepreneurs all over Europe are coming to London to start their businesses. And 40% of all the kind of tech companies in Europe are now in London. So it would be really, really sad if we disconnect.
So you said 40% of...
40%, about 40% of kind of venture, I don't know, maybe 35 to 40% venture capital in Europe is kind of is invested in the UK, and primarily in London.
Now, why London and Berlin? Why those 2 cities specifically, and why would you have preferred London?
Because it's just a bigger city. It's more, it is capital. But also it's such a multicultural city. And if you think about building a global business, it's very easy to recruit people from all around the world. You know, you have a lot of big businesses coming in and out of London, and it's just very, very connected. You know, Berlin and, you know, Stockholm, by the way, is also awesome to build companies. It's very, very thriving, but these are not as connected cities as London is.
Mm-hmm. And speaking of global connections, you've always said, now Atomico, your fund is now 10 years old. You've said that great companies can come from anywhere.
Yeah.
Now, and today in 2016, does a great company have to come out of Silicon Valley?
Yeah. So, good question. So, you know, when we started, that was the thesis, great company can come from anywhere. 10 years later, you know, the reality is that we've had 40 companies in Europe after Skype being, you know, getting $1 billion companies in Europe. So that's amazing. I think that's just, and really what's happened over the last 10 years is that the ecosystems here in Europe have really become mature. You have people, you know, like myself, you know, founders investing in other founders, but you know, you also have a lot of founders doing angel investing and really mentoring the next generation of entrepreneurs. You also have people working for some of these successful companies, gaining a lot of experience. They go out and start companies, and as a consequence, you have the top students at the universities are now really considering starting a company or joining a startup company as a viable career choice instead of like investment banking. So it's happening, and Europe is a really, really good place to build your business. You know, so actually 2/3 of the $1 billion companies are coming from outside of Silicon Valley.
2/3 outside of Silicon Valley.
Yeah.
Okay.
So Silicon Valley is still, you know, still the epicenter. There's no doubt about it, but you don't need to be there.
Mm-hmm. Now, I'm originally from San Francisco, and experiencing my first summer here makes me wish that this fireside chat had an actual fire involved. But one of the things I wanted to ask you was that there's a great infrastructure for startups in Silicon Valley, and it seems to be lacking here in terms of late-stage growth funds. Is that a real problem, and what can people like you do about it?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. So we have a really good situation in early-stage funding now. There's a lot of angel investors and a lot of new, smaller kind of Series A type investors. But when it comes to really scaling companies, we have a funding gap. Certainly with Atomico, we're trying to address that. We're investing from Series A, but also B and C and onwards. We have, you know, raising a much, much larger fund so we can really support companies. And I think, though, that over the next few years, that we will fill this funding gap. We have a great pension fund system and institutions here in Europe. They've been quite late to get on the game, but you're starting already now to see some of these large pension funds investing in tech through funds. And if the European pension funds allocated just 0.5% of their allocations into technology, we will have a better funding situation here than in the US. I think that can happen.
And how do you get big institutions like that to invest in tech companies?
I think, you know, you need, you know, a few thought leaders. Some of the Swedish pension funds are already starting to do this. And the reality is, like, if you're managing a pension fund, you think about not screwing things up. It's not very good for the people. So they're very conservative. So they want to see results. They want to see that performance, and they can start seeing that now. When we were talking to institutions like 5 years ago, you mentioned Europe and tech at the same meeting. It's like, that's the door. Today, they understand that it's actually the European tech ecosystem is happening. There's a lot of great companies being created here, some great category winners, and they understand that this is something that they want to be part of. So you're starting to see that happening slowly now in a few.
So you're saying that as Europe produces more very visible winners, that the institutional funds will get involved.
It's starting to happen.
So back in the U.S. now, we're seeing a downturn in tech valuations, just worries about their general outlook. What kind of position is Europe in to weather this downturn that has started in the U.S.?
Yeah, we're in a different phase here. And what has happened is that because we haven't had so much capital coming into the European market in the last few years, valuations haven't skyrocketed the way they did in the US. So actually, valuations last year in US was 3 times higher on the medium valuations than Europe. So as a matter of fact, the first quarter this year, there you have maybe 40% more Series A rounds and much more capital invested than last year. So we're not seeing a slowdown. I think there will be a little bit of a correction. Usually it takes longer time in Europe for things to correct, but you're not going to be as binary. In the US, it's very, very binary. Either it's full speed ahead or you're pulling the emergency brake. Here it's a little bit more steady.
And why is that? One of the things I noticed that there's a different culture in building companies in Europe than there is in Silicon Valley. It seems maybe because of the lack of infrastructure, companies here are leaner and more focused on profitability rather than growth. Is that, what do you make of that?
So because of that, companies here have been focused more on getting to profitability earlier and not being crazy about spending a lot of money. And therefore, there's probably a better situation for them in a potential down market.
Another thing that I noticed over here that hasn't quite made its way to the United States yet are these companies, for example, Rocket Internet in Germany, that has found a way to systemically replicate and export ideas from Silicon Valley or elsewhere all around the world. How is this good or bad for the tech industry?
Yeah, so Rocket is a one-off phenomenon. They're executing like no one else, and they have a history from copying not only Silicon Valley companies, copying European companies as well. And I think that's something that's very, very specific. Now they're focusing very much on emerging markets, and I think that what we do, we are betting on founders. We think that our thesis is that you need extraordinary founders to create fantastic companies, and you cannot do this as a machine. So we have a completely separate thesis of how we operate. We think that we want to back founders, we want to help the founders to scale. So it's a very different method.
We were just talking about sailing backstage about the America's Cup, and your theory was that Team Great Britain might have a best shot at winning the America's Cup next year because its founder is British, whereas Americans have an Australian skipper and whatnot.
The founder thesis. I think that Ben Ainslie has a chance. He has the best chance. If anyone going to beat Oracle, it's him, because it's not a corporation hiring a team. It's a founder going out, putting together his own team and getting backers here, local backers who are backing the founders. And I think that's just that founding mentality. You should not underestimate how strong that is, because then you get people to rally behind that founder.
At the same time, just to play devil's advocate, Rocket has trained hundreds of entrepreneurs that have gone through its system, and now you're seeing them trickle to other funds and starting their own companies. Do you think that has helped? How do you think that has affected the ecosystem?
I think it's great. So that you have, they're hiring so many people. They're hiring people out of school, young people, brilliant, smart people, ambitious people. People probably would probably go to work at like Goldman Sachs or McKinsey or Morgan Stanley for 2 years and then do something else. Now, if you go to work for Rocket for 2 years, it's like, that's probably better than to work for Goldman Sachs for 2 years. So I think they're actually training a lot of people to be entrepreneurs. They're really, really good in how to scale. They're very metrics driven, and so I think that's probably not a bad school for young people to go to. But I should certainly encourage them to go out after a few years and then start their own companies. Like everything we can do to encourage more people to become founders, to start companies, the better it is. So there are different ways to do it, and that's a good way.
Now at Atomico, you've brought in more founders into the firm.
Yeah.
Why is that, and do they focus more on existing portfolio companies rather than new investments?
So we have this, again, this founder thesis is something that's very strong for us. We think that founders are the best advisors to other founders. Founders have gone through the challenges, made mistakes, and they can understand the situation another founder is. It's sometimes very, very lonely to be a founder. And also, investments in venture capital should be conviction-driven. It's not like a numbers game, it's convictions. And I think founders are better to understand, to see something that they get higher conviction. So our founders in our team, we have a lot of successful founders in Atomico, and they're both doing sourcing, but also we're helping them portfolio companies. And we also, in addition to founders, we also have some executives. We have people who scaled Uber, scaled Spotify, scaled Skype, and Facebook and so forth. So they have people who've been part of scaling some of the most successful companies, and they can really help companies to scale.
Mm-hmm. Just talking to new companies and talking with the founders that you brought in, what do you think are going to be the major themes in the tech industry in Europe over the next couple of years?
So, you talked about this whole copycat, and maybe you can look at 3 different stages. We had 10 years ago, most things were kind of copycats. Then you had an era where you had some really strong companies, original companies becoming category leaders, companies like Spotify, King, Supercell, maybe Skype. I think what I started to see now, a few data points, and is that you're starting to see more deep technology companies as well. And I think that we are the best in the world in artificial intelligence. DeepMind is from here, from UK. It's an amazing company, amazing talent. We're the best in the world in gaming with King and Supercell, Rovio, Minecraft. We're the best in the world in music services, Spotify, SoundCloud, and so forth. So I think you're going to see more and more technology companies as well. We're starting to see a few more kind of really deep technology companies.
Mm-hmm. How do these companies defend their market leader position over here when we're living in, again, a more connected world today?
Yeah. So what's really interesting is that, I'm from Sweden. We're 9 million people, and entrepreneurs in Sweden understand that you need to build a global company from day one. When we built Skype, it was from day one said it's a global company. When we look at the data of companies, it's very clear that the correlation that the size of the country and how fast a company goes international. So in the next 4 or 5 years, they're probably going to have 1 million more online users through smartphones, and they're going to come all in emerging markets. And if you're coming from a really big market like the US or China, it takes you a few years before you go international. So I think that companies coming from smaller European countries, looking at going international faster, may actually start to have a competitive advantage because of this international mindset. Again, being here in London, hiring people from all around the world actually who lives here is a competitive advantage. So I will always encourage entrepreneurs to think about globalization and going global as soon as they have a product market fit, and then you can actually have a competitive advantage.
And I think we have time for just to wrap up the conversation. Well, when you encourage these entrepreneurs to go global, what are 2 or 3 of the pieces of advice that you give them in expanding? Yeah,
well, first of all, you should not do it too early. You need to make sure you have your product market if it needs to be there. You don't want to start iterating on multiple markets at the same time. So you need to make sure you have a very solid product market fit. And then you need to have the best team around you. You need to have the best people who have some experience who can help you with that. And then also understanding that different markets are different, and you need to try to make sure you have a core of your product that is kind of very global, and then see what are the things that I need to adjust, and also understanding that how you do business in Japan is very different from how you do business in China and Brazil and so forth. So getting advice how to do that in different markets is probably not a bad thing.
But if you were to boil that down into one sentence, what would you tell your entrepreneurs looking abroad?
First, as soon as you have a great product market fit, you should expand internationally, and you should get the best people around you to help you to do that scaling.
Okay, simple advice. Well, I hope you enjoyed our conversation with Skype co-founder and Atomico chief executive, Niklas Zennstrom.
Thank you.